Introduction: the red heart of nowhere. The year was 1930, and the Australian Outback stretched endlessly like a canvas painted in shades of rust and gold. Here, where civilization seemed to dissolve into the shimmering heat, small settlements clung to life with the tenacity of desert flowers after rain. One such place was Millbrook Station, a cluster of weathered buildings, a general store, a pub, and a small medical clinic, all connected by dusty roads that led nowhere and everywhere at once. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corrugated iron roofs as the town slowly awakened. Aboriginal stockmen moved cattle across distant paddocks, their calls carrying on the wind like ancient songs. Telegraph wires hummed with messages from the outside world, while windmills creaked their eternal rhythm, drawing precious water from deep beneath the parched earth. In this harsh but beautiful landscape, where men were measured by their ability to survive and women by their capacity to support, lived Nurse Louise Hartwell. At 52, she possessed a kind of understated strength that comes from weathering life's storms without complaint. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, her hands bore the calluses of honest work, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen both the cruelty and kindness that life could offer. Louise had arrived at Millbrook Station 3 years earlier, following Dr. William Kinnan, the respected physician who had established the region's only proper medical facility. To the townspeople, her role seemed simple enough. She assisted the doctor, kept the clinic tidy, and yes, brewed countless cups of tea for worried families in the waiting area. That was how they saw her, the woman who made tea while the real work was done by more important people. But Louise knew medicine. She had trained as a nurse in Adelaide before the Great War, had tended to wounded soldiers in field hospitals where supplies ran short and hope ran shorter. She understood anatomy and pharmacology, could stitch wounds that would heal clean, and had an intuitive sense for when a fever would break or when a patient was slipping away. Yet here in Millbrook, her knowledge remained largely invisible, acknowledged only in small moments when Dr. McKinnon would catch her eye and nod with quiet appreciation. The social fabric of 1930s rural Australia was woven tight with expectations. Men worked the land, ran the businesses, made the decisions. Women kept house, raised children, and provided comfort. A woman who stepped beyond these boundaries was viewed with suspicion, her competence questioned, her motives analyzed. Louise had learned to navigate these waters carefully, offering her expertise subtly, never challenging the established order directly. Dr. McKinnon, a widower in his late 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands, had come to rely on Louise more than anyone realized. He valued her insights, trusted her judgment, and found himself looking forward to their quiet conversations over morning tea before the day's patients arrived. But even he, shaped by the conventions of his time, sometimes failed to see the full extent of her capabilities. The clinic itself was a testament to necessity rather than comfort. 2 examination rooms, a small surgery, a dispensary lined with brown glass bottles, and a waiting area furnished with mismatched chairs and worn magazine from the city. The floors were scrubbed daily, the instruments sterilized with careful precision, and the air perpetually scented with carbolic acid and eucalyptus oil. On this particular morning, as Louise arranged fresh bandages and checked the medicine supplies, she noticed Dr. McKinnon moving more slowly than usual. His face appeared pale despite the desert sun, and she caught him gripping the edge of his desk as if steadying himself. When she offered to bring him tea, he waved her away with uncharacteristic irritation. "I'm perfectly fine, Louise," he said, though his voice carried a hoarseness that hadn't been there the day before. "Just tired from the Henderson emergency last night." Louise nodded but made a mental note to keep watching. In her experience, doctors made the worst patients, too proud to admit vulnerability and too familiar with symptoms to ignore their implications. She busied herself with morning preparations, but her attention remained partly focused on the man who had become not just her employer, but her closest friend in this isolated place. The first patient began arriving as the sun climbed higher. Mrs. Patterson was the youngest, who had developed a persistent cough, old Tom Bradley needing his blood pressure checked. Young Mary Sullivan, nervous and glowing with early pregnancy, seeking reassurance that everything was progressing normally. Louise greeted each with genuine warmth, took their basic information, and tried not to notice how Dr. McKinnon's hands trembled slightly as he wrote notes. By midday, When the heat had driven most sensible people into the shade, Dr. McKinnon excused himself to lie down, claiming he needed just a few minutes' rest. Louise found him an hour later, collapsed beside his bed, burning with fever and barely conscious. His pulse was rapid and fretty, his breathing shallow, and when she called his name, his eyes struggled to focus on her face. "William," she whispered, using his first name for perhaps the first time since arriving in Millbrook. "Can you hear me?" He mumbled something incoherent, and Louise felt a familiar surge of clinical assessment taking over her concern. High fever, altered consciousness, rapid onset. It could be several things, none of them good. She needed to get him to the clinic, start treatment, and then she realized the magnitude of the situation. Dr. William Kinnan was the only qualified physician within 200 miles. The nearest hospital was a day's journey by truck over rough roads. The telegraph could summon help, but help would take time to arrive, time they might not have. And in the meantime, there would be other patients, other emergencies, other people depending on medical care that now rested solely in her hands. Louise helped the semi-conscious doctor to the clinic, settling him in the small recovery room behind the main surgery. She took his temperature, 104 degrees, checked his pupils, listened to his heart and lungs. The symptoms suggested a severe infection, possibly influenza or pneumonia, both of which could prove fatal without proper care. She began treatment immediately: aspirin to reduce the fever, fluids to prevent dehydration, cool compressors to bring down his temperature. Word spread quickly through Millbrook Station, as news always did in small towns. By evening, concerned residents had gathered outside the clinic, their voices carrying through the thin walls. What are we supposed to do now? Can she really handle this on her own? Maybe we should send for help from Broken Hill. But that'll take days, and what if someone gets hurt before then? I mean, she's just a nurse, isn't she? Makes tea and such. Louise heard these conversations and felt the weight of their skepticism pressing down on her shoulders. She had faced this doubt before, in military hospitals where some doctors dismissed her observations, in Adelaide where senior physicians questioned her recommendations. But this was different. This time, she was truly alone, with an entire community's health resting in her hands. As night fell over the Outback, painting the sky in brilliant purples and golds, Louise sat beside Dr. McKinnon's bed, monitoring his condition and planning for the days ahead. She thought about the medicine cabinet, mentally cataloging supplies and calculating what might be needed. She considered the patients who would come tomorrow, the emergencies that might arise, the trust she would have to earn one careful decision at a time. The desert wind whispered through the gaps in the building, carrying scents of sage and dust and possibilities. Somewhere in the distance, a dingo called to its pack, and the sound reminded Louise that survival here required more than hope. It demanded courage, resourcefulness, and the willingness to stand tall when others expected you to remain small. She pulled a blanket around her shoulders and settled into the chair beside the doctor's bed, ready to begin the longest watch of her life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new doubts to overcome, and new opportunities to prove that some people are capable of far more than the world expects of them. The woman they thought was just there to brew tea was about to become the steady hand that would guide Millbrook Station through its darkest hour. Underscore 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 underscore. And if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt your quiet strength go unseen, the story is for you. Subscribe now and stay with us as we journey deep into the heart of the Outback, where courage blooms quietly and love finds root in the most unexpected places. And before we begin, tell us in the comments, have you ever been overlooked only to prove them wrong? Chapter 1, The Weight of Underestimation. 3 years earlier, Louise Hartwell had arrived at Millbrook Station carrying little more than a worn leather satchel and a heart heavy with loss. She had left Adelaide not in search of adventure, but in flight from memories that clung to familiar streets like shadows at noon. Her husband of 23 years had passed away after lingering illness, and their small house had felt too large, too quiet, too full of echoes from a life that would never return. Dr. McKinnon had placed an advertisement in the Adelaide Advertiser. Experienced nurse sought for remote medical practice. Accommodation provided. Suitable for single woman seeking change of scenery. Louise had responded not because she craved isolation, but because she needed distance from the well-meaning sympathy of neighbors and the constant reminders of what she had lost. The train journey from Adelaide had taken her through landscapes that gradually shed their green respectability, trading pastoral fields for scrubland, then scrubland for true desert. At each station, the platform grew smaller, the buildings lower, the faces fewer. By the time she reached the rail terminus at Broken Hill, Louise felt as though she had traveled not just across miles, but across worlds. Dr. McKinnon had met her there, a tall man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair who spoke with a measured cadence of someone accustomed to delivering both good news and bad. During the long truck ride to Millbrook, he had explained the realities of outback medicine, limited supplies, vast distances between patients, and the need to be creative with treatments when conventional options weren't available. The people here are good, he had told her as they navigated the rutted road, red dust billowing behind them, but they can be traditional in their thinking. They'll need time to warm up to you. Louise had nodded, understanding that traditional thinking was often code for skepticism about women in professional roles. She had encountered it before in Adelaide, where some patients requested to see a real doctor when she provided treatment, and where hospital administrators consistently paid female nurses less than their male counterparts despite identical qualifications and superior performance. Her first weeks in Millbrook had confirmed Dr. McKinnon's gentle warning. The townspeople were polite but distant, greeting her with reserved nods and careful small talk. They brought their ailments to the clinic willingly enough, but their eyes invariably sought Dr. McKinnon's face for reassurance, even when Louise was the one cleaning their wounds or preparing their medications. Tom Bradley, the elderly stockman who managed the station's cattle, had been particularly direct in his assessment. "No offense, miss," he had said after Louise sutured a deep gash on his forearm with neat, precise stitches, "but it'll be good to have Dr. McKinnon take a look at this tomorrow, just to be sure." Louise had simply smiled and nodded. Though privately she knew her suturing was superior to the doctor's, her hands were steadier, her technique more refined by years of emergency work. But challenging Tom's assumption would have been counterproductive, marking her as difficult or presumptuous in a community where reputation mattered more than individual recognition. Mrs. Angela Morrison, the station master's wife and the town's unofficial social coordinator, had made Louise's position even clearer during a conversation at the general store. "It's wonderful that Dr. McKinnon has found himself such a capable assistant," she had said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "A woman's touch makes all the difference in making patients comfortable. And your tea is absolutely lovely. Day." The message was unmistakable. Louise was valued for her feminine qualities, her ability to provide comfort, to serve refreshments, to make the harsh environment of medical care more palatable. Her actual medical expertise was either invisible or irrelevant to people who had already decided what role she should play. Even Dr. McKinnon, despite his genuine respect for her abilities, sometimes fell into the patterns that society had carved for them. He would explain procedures to her that she already understood, or double-check her work in ways that suggested uncertainty about her competence rather than standard medical practice. Louise recognized that he meant no harm. He was simply a product of his time and training, but each small doubt chipped away at her confidence like water wearing down stone. The children of Millbrook Station proved to be Louise's first allies, perhaps because they hadn't yet learned to see limitations where society said they should exist. When 6-year-old Peter Henderson fell from a windmill and opened a gash on his scalp, he cried for the nurse lady rather than the doctor. When the Kowalski twins came down with chickenpox, they asked specifically for Louise's cool hands on their feverish foreheads. "She makes the hurt go away," little Sarah Kowalski had explained to her mother, words that carried more weight than any medical degree. Gradually, Louise had found her rhythm in Millbrook Station. She rose each morning before dawn to prepare the clinic, checking supplies and sterilizing instruments while the desert air still carried the cool promise of night. She learned the names of everyone within 50 miles, their medical histories, their family relationships, their fears and hopes. She discovered which patients needed extra reassurance and which preferred straightforward facts. She identified the early warning signs of the region's common ailments: heat stroke, dehydration, snakebite, and the various injuries that came from working with large animals and heavy machinery. Her living quarters were simple but adequate: a small room behind the clinic with a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, and a shelf for a few books. The walls were thin enough that she could hear patients arriving at all hours, and she had developed the ability to wake instantly when needed, a skill honed during her wartime service when emergencies tolerated no delay. Dr. McKinnon had proven to be a thoughtful colleague and, gradually, a friend. He listened to her observations about patients, incorporated her suggestions into treatment plans, and shared stories of his own medical training over quiet dinners when the clinic was empty. Louise learned that he had lost his wife to pneumonia 5 years earlier, that he had come to the Outback seeking the same kind of distance from painful memories that had driven her from Adelaide. Their friendship was proper and professional, but Louise would have been dishonest if she claimed to feel nothing more. There was something comforting about William Kinnon's presence, a steadiness that reminded her of the security she had lost when her husband passed away. But she was careful not to let these feelings show, understanding that any hint of romantic interest would further complicate her already tenuous position in the community. The social hierarchy of Millbrook Station was as clearly defined as the geological layers in the nearby cliffs. At the top were the station owners and managers, followed by skilled workers like Dr. McKinnon, then shopkeepers and clerks, and finally the labourers and Aboriginal workers who were barely acknowledged in polite conversation. Women occupied a parallel structure based on their husband positions, with unmarried women like Louise existing in an ambiguous space that made some people uncomfortable. This hierarchy influenced every aspect of daily life. At community gatherings, Louise was invited to help serve food, but not asked to contribute her opinions on important matters. When the town council met to discuss health concerns, Dr. McKinnon was consulted, but Louise's input was neither sought nor welcomed. She learned to navigate these social waters carefully, offering assistance when asked but never pushing herself forward in ways that might be seen as presumptuous. The isolation of Millbrook Station also meant that news traveled slowly but completely. Everyone knew everyone's business, from financial troubles to family disputes to romantic entanglements. Louise understood that her every action was observed and discussed, that any misstep would be magnified and remembered. This scrutiny made her cautious, perhaps more cautious than she needed to be, but in a small community where reputation was everything, caution seemed the wisest course. As Dr. McKinnon's illness progressed through its first day, Louise felt the weight of all these accumulated expectations and limitations pressing down on her. The people of Millbrook Station had spent 3 years seeing her as a helper, an assistant, a woman who made good tea and provided gentle comfort. Now she would have to become something else entirely: their primary medical caregiver, their source of healing and hope, their guardian against the countless ailments and injuries that could befall a remote community. She sat beside the doctor's bed in the small hours of the morning, listening to his labored breathing and feeling the responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. Outside, the desert wind whistled through the gaps in the buildings, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the night sounds of the outback, the call of a mopoke owl, the rustle of small creatures in the spinifex grass, the endless whisper of wind across sand and stone. By dawn, Dr. McKinnon's fever had climbed even higher, and Louise knew that a time of being underestimated was about to end. Whether the townspeople were ready or not, they were about to discover what she was truly capable of accomplishing. The woman who had spent 3 years pouring tea and offering gentle comfort was about to step into the light and show them all what strength looked like when it had been quietly growing in the shadows. Chapter 2. Holding the Line. The sun hadn't yet painted the horizon when Mrs. Sarah Patterson arrived at the clinic, her youngest child in her arms and panic etched across her weathered face. Little James, barely 2 years old, had been burning with fever through the night, and his breathing had become increasingly labored. Sarah had walked the 3 miles from her homestead in the pre-dawn darkness, guided only by starlight and a mother's desperate determination. "Is Dr. McKinnon available?" she asked breathlessly, her eyes scanning past Louise toward the main examination room. "Jimmy's getting worse, and I don't know what to do." Louise felt a familiar sting of being overlooked, but she pushed it aside as she gently took the child from his mother's arms. James was indeed burning with fever, his small body limp and his breathing shallow. His lips had a bluish tinge that Louise recognized immediately as a sign of respiratory distress. Dr. McKinnon is gravely ill himself, Louise said softly, her hands already assessing the child's condition with practiced efficiency. But I'm here, and I'm going to take very good care of Jimmy. Sarah's face crumpled with fear and confusion. Can you really? Shouldn't we send for another doctor? The nearest physician is in Broken Hill, a full day's journey away, Louise replied, her voice calm and reassuring despite the urgency she felt. Jimmy can't wait that long, and honestly, I wouldn't want him to. I've treated hundreds of children with similar symptoms, and I know exactly what needs to be done. She had already begun examining the boy as she spoke, checking his pulse, listening to his lungs, observing his skin color and muscle tone. The symptoms suggested pneumonia, possibly complicated by dehydration and exhaustion. It was serious but treatable if handled promptly and correctly. Louise worked with a quiet confidence that came from years of experience, preparing medications and cool compresses while explaining each step to the worried mother. She started Jimmy on a reduced dose of aspirin to bring down his fever, administered fluids to combat dehydration, and created a steam tent using eucalyptus oil to help ease his breathing. Will he be all right? Sarah whispered, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. He's a strong boy, Louise replied, though she kept her deeper concerns to herself. The next few hours will tell us a lot. I'll need you to help me keep him cool and comfortable, and we'll monitor his breathing very carefully. As the morning progressed, other patients began arriving, and Louise faced the challenge of managing multiple cases while maintaining continuous care for young James. Tom Bradley arrived with an infected cut on his hand that had begun to show red streaks, a sure sign that the infection was spreading. Mrs. Henderson needed her blood pressure checked and her medication refilled. The Aboriginal stockman, Charlie Munro, had been kicked by a horse and suspected he might have broken ribs. Each patient presented Louise with the same initial reaction: surprise at Dr. McKinnon's absence, doubt about her ability to provide adequate care, and reluctant acceptance that she was their only option. Louise met each response with patient professionalism, neither defending her qualifications nor apologizing for the circumstances. Instead, she let her actions speak for themselves. Tom Bradley's infected cut required thorough cleaning and debridement, a painful procedure that Louise performed with swift precision. She explained what she was doing as she worked, describing the signs of infection and the importance of keeping the wound clean and dry. When she finished, Tom examined the neat bandage and grudgingly admitted, "That's proper professional work. That is." Mrs. Henderson's blood pressure was dangerously high, requiring immediate attention and medication adjustment. Louise caught the problem that Dr. McKinnon had missed during the previous visit, a subtle change in symptoms that suggested a more serious underlying condition. Her careful questioning revealed that Mrs. Henderson had been experiencing mild chest pain and shortness of breath, classic signs of heart trouble that required immediate treatment. "You need to take this very seriously," Louise told her gently but firmly. "I'm adjusting your medication and giving you strict instructions about diet and activity. If you experience any chest pain or severe shortness of breath, you must come to the clinic immediately, day or night." Charlie Munro's injury proved to be the most challenging case of the morning. The Aboriginal stockman had been reluctant to seek treatment at all, knowing that his people were often treated as second-class patients in white medical facilities. But the pain in his ribs was severe, and he had finally decided to risk the potential humiliation. Louise examined him with the same careful attention she gave to all her patients, taking extra time to explain her findings and ensure his comfort. 2 ribs were indeed cracked, though not displaced, and there was significant bruising across his chest and back. She bound his ribs properly, provided pain medication, and gave him detailed instructions for recovery. "You'll need to rest for at least 2 weeks, she told him. "No heavy lifting, no riding if you can avoid it. Come back in 3 days so I can check your progress." Charlie nodded, but Louise could see the worry in his eyes. Time off work meant lost wages, and for a man supporting a family on a stockman's pay, that was a serious concern. "I'll speak with the station manager," Louise added quietly, "Explain that this is a legitimate medical leave. You were injured doing your job, and you deserve time to heal properly." The gratitude in Charlie's eyes was worth more than any official recognition could have been. Word would spread through the Aboriginal workers that the nurse had treated one of their own with respect and advocacy, and Louise knew that trust would be invaluable in the challenging days ahead. By midday, the clinic was fuller than it had ever been during normal operating hours. Word had spread that Dr. McKinnon was seriously ill, and people were arriving with ailments they had been postponing, afraid that medical care might soon be unavailable entirely. Louise found herself treating everything from minor cuts to chronic conditions, each case requiring her full attention while she simultaneously monitored James Patterson's condition and kept watch over the unconscious doctor. The heat of the day was building, and the clinic's thin walls did little to keep out the oppressive desert sun. Louise had learned to work efficiently in high temperatures, but the stress of managing so many patients while bearing sole responsibility for the community's health was beginning to tell. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she moved between examination rooms, checking on patients, preparing medications, and providing reassurance to worried families. It was during this chaotic afternoon that the first real emergency occurred. A young man named Billy Sullivan came racing into the clinic on horseback, his face pale with panic. "Miss Hartwell," he shouted, using her formal name in his distress. "You've got to come quick. There's been an accident at the bore site. My father and 2 other men are trapped under fallen timber." Louise felt her heart skip, but her hands remained steady as she gathered emergency supplies. This was the kind of situation that could make or break her standing in the community. 3 men's lives hung in the balance, and she would be the one responsible for their care. "How far is the accident site?" she asked, already packing bandages, antiseptic, and pain medication. "About 5 miles north, near the old windmill. We've got a truck waiting." Louise looked around the clinic at her other patients. James Patterson's fever had begun to respond to treatment, but he still required monitoring. Mrs. Henderson needed to rest quietly for another hour. Charlie Munro was stable but shouldn't be left completely alone. Dr. McKinnon remained unconscious but seemed slightly more stable than the previous day. "Mrs. Patterson," Louise called to James's mother, "I need to leave for an emergency, but I'll be back as soon as possible. Continue the cool compressors every 15 minutes. And if his breathing becomes more difficult, send someone to fetch me immediately. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, her face reflecting both trust and terror. "What about the others?" "Mrs. Henderson, you're to rest quietly in the chair by the window. Don't move around more than necessary. Charlie, keep an eye on things for me. If anyone arrives with a serious emergency, send word to the bore site." It was an unprecedented situation, leaving patients in the care of other patients, trusting community members to maintain basic medical protocols in her absence. But Louise had no choice, and she had learned to read people well enough to know that Sarah Patterson and Charlie Munro would follow her instructions carefully. The truck ride to the accident site was a bone-jarring journey over rough terrain, with Billy Sullivan providing breathless details about what had happened. A makeshift derrick used for drilling a new water bore had collapsed, trapping 3 men under heavy timber beams. One was his father, Patrick Sullivan, the bore crew supervisor. The other 2 were younger workers whose names Louise didn't recognize. When they arrived at the site, Louise immediately took charge of the rescue effort. Her wartime experience had taught her how to organize emergency care under difficult conditions, and she applied those lessons now with quick efficiency. "I need you men to clear a path to each victim," she instructed the gathered workers. "Carefully, don't move the timber until I've assessed their injuries. And someone set up a work area under that tarpaulin where I can treat them properly." Patrick Sullivan was pinned under a beam across his legs, conscious but clearly in severe pain. One of the younger men had a head injury and was unconscious. The third was alert but had suffered what appeared to be internal injuries based on his pale complexion and rapid, shallow breathing. Louise worked systematically, providing immediate treatment to stabilize each victim before organizing their careful extraction from the wreckage. Patrick's legs were badly crushed, but the bones weren't protruding. Painful but probably not life-threatening if treated properly. The unconscious man had a concussion, but his pupils were reactive and his breathing was steady. The third victim worried her most. His symptoms suggested possible internal bleeding that could prove fatal without surgical intervention. "We need to get them all back to the clinic as quickly as possible," she announced after completing her initial assessments. "But we have to transport them carefully to avoid making their injuries worse." The men rigged stretchers from timber and canvas, following Louise's specific instructions about how to move each patient safely. She rode in the back of the truck with the most seriously injured man, monitoring his pulse and breathing while keeping constant pressure on his abdominal injury. Back at the clinic, Louise faced the most challenging few hours of a medical career. 3 seriously injured men required simultaneous care while other patients still needed attention. James Patterson's condition had continued to improve, but he wasn't out of danger yet. Dr. McKinnon remained unconscious, though his fever seemed to have stabilized. Louise organized the available space efficiently, setting up makeshift hospital beds and establishing priorities for treatment. Patrick Sullivan's crushed legs required immediate attention to prevent permanent damage. The unconscious worker needed careful monitoring for signs of brain swelling. The man with internal injuries required emergency surgery that pushed Louise's skills to their absolute limits. Working by lantern light as darkness fell across the outback, Louise operated on the injured worker with the community watching from outside the clinic windows. She had performed similar procedures during wartime, but always under the supervision of qualified surgeons. Now she was alone, following her training and instincts as she worked to stop internal bleeding and repair damaged organs. The operation lasted 3 hours, with Louise maintaining steady hands and clear thinking despite the enormous pressure. When she finally emerged from the surgery, exhausted and blood-stained, she found a crowd of townspeople waiting anxiously for news. "He's going to survive," she announced simply, too tired for elaborate explanations. All 3 men should recover, though Mr. Sullivan will need months to regain full use of his legs. The response was unlike anything Louise had experienced in her 3 years at Millbrook Station. Tom Bradley stepped forward first, his weathered face reflecting genuine respect and gratitude. "Miss Hartwell," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. We all do. You saved those men's lives today, and you've been taking care of all of us better than we deserved." Mrs. Morrison, the station mouse's wife who had once patronized Louise about her woman's touch, approached with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how we can ever thank you properly," she whispered. "You've shown us what real strength looks like." One by one, the townspeople stepped forward to offer their gratitude and respect. These were people who had spent 3 years seeing Louise as merely an assistant, a helper, a woman who made good tea. But crisis had stripped away their preconceptions, revealing the truth that had been there all along. She was a healer, a leader, and a person of extraordinary competence and courage. As the crowd finally dispersed and Louise settled down to monitor her patients through the night, she reflected on the day's events. She was exhausted in every possible way, but there was also a deep satisfaction in knowing that she had met the community's greatest need and proven herself worthy of their trust. James Patterson slept peacefully in his mother's arms, his fever broken and his breathing clear. The 3 injured workers were stable and comfortable. Dr. McKinnon's condition seemed slightly improved, and Louise allowed herself to hope that he might be turning a corner. Outside, the desert night was alive with sounds. The distant call of dingoes, the whisper of wind through the spinifex, the gentle creaking of the windmill that drew life-giving water from deep underground. Louise pulled a blanket around her shoulders and settled into her chair, ready for another long watch but no longer feeling quite so alone. The woman they had underestimated for 3 years had finally shown them who she really was. And in doing so, she had discovered something about herself that she had forgotten during the long months of grief and doubt following her husband's death. She was strong, she was capable, and she was exactly where she belonged. Chapter 3. The Heart Knows. Dr. William Kinnon's recovery began slowly, like dawn breaking over the desert horizon. At first just a barely perceptible lightening, then gradually growing stronger until the darkness finally retreated. On the 4th day of his illness, his fever broke completely, leaving him weak but lucid for the first time since falling ill. Louise was changing the dressing on Patrick Sullivan's injured leg when she heard a familiar voice calling her name from the recovery room. She finished securing the bandage with practiced efficiency before hurrying to check on her colleague and friend. "William," she said softly, relief evident in her voice as she saw his clear, focused eyes. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a mob of cattle," he replied with a weak smile, "but considerably better than yesterday." Or was it yesterday? I seem to have lost track of time. "You've been unconscious for 4 days," Louise explained as she checked his pulse and temperature. "Severe pneumonia complicated by high fever. You gave us quite a scare." Dr. McKinnon tried to sit up, but found himself too weak for the effort. 4 days? But the patients, the clinic, how have you managed? Louise helped him settle back against his pillows before answering. "We've been busy, but everything has been handled. Would you like some broth? You need to rebuild your strength gradually." As she prepared a light meal for the recovering doctor, Louise could hear the sounds of activity throughout the clinic. Mrs. Patterson was reading quietly to young James, whose recovery had been complete and swift. Charlie Munro had returned for his follow-up appointment and was discussing his progress with Patrick Sullivan, who had become an unofficial patient coordinator from his bed. The man Louise had operated on, she had learned that his name was Robert Chen, a young worker from Adelaide, was awake and taking clear fluids. "Louise," Dr. McKinnon said as she helped him sip the warm broth, "I can hear multiple patients out there. How many people are you treating?" "Currently, we have 3 patients who require extended care, plus the usual daily visits for routine matters. Nothing I can't handle." Dr. McKinnon studied her face, noting the tired lines around her eyes and the way she moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had been carrying a heavy load for days. "Tell me what happened while I was ill. I can see that something significant has occurred." Louise hesitated, unsure how to summarize the events that had transformed her standing in the community. The bore site accident, the emergency surgery, the gradual shift in how people saw and spoke to her. It all seemed too large and complex to capture in a simple explanation. "There was an accident," she finally said. 3 men were injured when a drilling rig collapsed. I had to perform emergency surgery on one of them. Everyone has been very supportive. Emergency surgery. Dr. McKinnon's voice carried surprise and concern. "Louise, that's well beyond the scope of nursing practice. What if something had gone wrong?" Louise felt a familiar flash of defensive anger, but she suppressed it quickly. William was speaking from genuine concern, not dismissiveness, and his reaction was understandable given the medical and legal conventions of their time. "Something would have gone wrong if I hadn't acted," Louise replied quietly. "Robert Chen was bleeding internally, and the nearest surgeon was a day's journey away. I had 2 choices, attempt the procedure or watch him die. I chose to try. And he survived. Is recovering well. The operation was successful." Dr. McKinnon was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information. He had worked alongside Louise for 3 years and had gradually come to appreciate her knowledge and instincts, but he was only now beginning to understand the full extent of her capabilities. "Where did you learn surgical techniques?" he asked finally. "During the war," Louise said simply. "Field hospitals often operated with minimal supervision. Nurses learned to do whatever was necessary to save lives." As Dr. McKinnon's strength gradually returned over the following days, he became an observer of the transformed dynamics within the clinic. Patients who had once looked past Louise now sought her opinion directly. Tom Bradley asked her advice about managing his arthritis. Mrs. Henderson requested that Louise personally monitor her heart condition. Charlie Munro brought his wife and children for routine care, specifically requesting the nurse who helped me. Most tellingly, when new patients arrive at the clinic, they often ask for Nurse Louise by name, having heard from others about her skill and compassion. The woman who had once been invisible had become the first person many people thought of when they needed medical care. Dr. McKinnon watched these interactions with growing awareness and, if he was honest with himself, growing admiration. Louise moved through her duties with quiet confidence, making clinical decisions that proved consistently sound and demonstrating a bedside manner that put patients at ease while maintaining professional authority. "You've changed," he told her one evening as they shared a quiet dinner after the clinic had closed. "Or perhaps I should say, you've revealed who you always were." Louise looked up from a plate, unsure how to respond to such a personal observation. The people of Millbrook see you differently now, William continued. But more importantly, you carry yourself differently. You're not apologizing for your knowledge anymore. I suppose I learned that apologizing doesn't help anyone, Louise replied. When people's lives are at stake, humility becomes a luxury none of us can afford. Their conversations during this period began to take on a more intimate quality, moving beyond professional matters to touch on personal histories, dreams, and the loneliness that had brought them both to this remote corner of the world. Dr. McKinnon spoke about his late wife, Elizabeth, and how her death had left him feeling unmoored from the life he had carefully constructed in Adelaide. I came here thinking I was running away, he admitted, but perhaps I was actually searching for something I hadn't yet recognized. Louise shared her own story more fully than she ever had before. The pain of losing her husband, the gradual realization that her life in Adelaide had become a series of empty routines, and the hope that distance might provide the perspective she needed to rebuild her sense of purpose. I thought I was too old to start over, she said. 52 seemed like an age for settling into whatever life had already given you, not for discovering new possibilities. And now, Louise considered the question carefully. Now I realize that age is less important than readiness. I wasn't ready to see my own strength when I first arrived here. I needed time to heal before I could fully inhabit who I was meant to become. Their friendship deepened during these quiet evening conversations, and Louise became increasingly aware of the comfort she found in William's presence. He listened to her thoughts without judgment, valued her opinions, and treated her as an equal in ways that few men of their generation ever managed. But she was careful not to read too much into their growing closeness, understanding that gratitude and loneliness could easily be mistaken for deeper feelings. Dr. McKinnon, meanwhile, found himself seeing Louise with new eyes. Her competence had always impressed him, but now he recognized something more, a strength of character that had been tested under the most difficult circumstances and proven absolutely reliable. The woman who sat across from him each evening, discussing the day's patients and sharing quiet observations about life in the Outback, was someone he had come to depend on in ways that went far beyond professional necessity. One evening, as they reviewed the treatment plans for their remaining patients, William made an observation that surprised them both with its directness. You know, Louise, this clinic has been more efficient and effective during the past week than it's ever been under my sole management. Your organizational skills, your patient rapport, your clinical instincts, they're all superior to my own in many ways. Louise felt heat rise in her cheeks. That's very kind, but hardly accurate. You're the trained physician, and I'm simply... You're simply one of the most gifted healers I've ever encountered, William interrupted gently. Training is important, but it's not everything. You have an intuitive understanding of medicine that can't be taught in any medical school. The law wouldn't agree with that assessment, Louise replied, though she couldn't hide her pleasure at his words. The law is changing, slowly. Women are beginning to enter medical schools in larger numbers, and nursing practice is expanding to include more responsibilities. But regardless of what the law says, I know what I've observed, and I know what the people of this community have learned about your abilities. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the clinic door. Louise opened it to find Sarah Patterson holding young James, who had recovered completely from his pneumonia but had developed a mild ear infection. I'm sorry to bother you so late, Sarah said, but Jimmy's been fussing all evening, and I wondered if you might take a look at him. Louise examined the boy quickly, confirming the ear infection and preparing appropriate treatment. As she worked, she noticed that Sarah's attention was focused entirely on her, with only polite nods of acknowledgement toward Dr. McKinnon. Will you be available to check him again tomorrow? Sarah asked as Louise finished treating her son. Of course, bring him by mid-morning, and we'll see how he's responding to the medication. After Sarah left, William looked at Louise with an expression that mixed amusement with something deeper. Did you notice that she didn't ask to see me at all? 3 weeks ago, that woman wouldn't have trusted you to take a child's temperature without my supervision. People change their minds when circumstances require it, Louise replied, but she was pleased by the observation. It's more than that, William said seriously. They recognize what I should have seen clearly from the beginning. You're not my assistant, Louise. You're my partner, and in many ways, you're the better healer of the two of us." Louise felt something shift in the space between them, a recognition that their relationship had evolved beyond the boundaries of professional collaboration or simple friendship. The way William was looking at her carried an intensity that made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't experienced since her husband's death. "William," she said softly, uncertain how to navigate this new territory. "I know it's complicated," he replied, moving closer to where she stood by the medicine cabinet. "I know there are social expectations and professional considerations that make this difficult. But I also know that I've never met anyone who combines such strength with such gentleness, such competence with such compassion." Louise found herself looking into his kind eyes, seeing not just gratitude or loneliness, but genuine affection and respect. "I care about you too," she whispered, admitting feelings she had kept carefully hidden. "But I'm not sure what that means for us, given everything else." "It means we don't have to figure everything out tonight," William said, reaching out to touch her hand gently. "But it also means we don't have to pretend that what's growing between us isn't real." They stood together in the quiet clinic, surrounded by the tools of their shared calling, and Louise allowed herself to acknowledge what her heart had been trying to tell her for weeks. Her feelings for William Kinnan weren't just a result of proximity or shared experience. They grew from genuine compatibility, mutual respect, and the rare joy of being truly seen and valued by another person. "The people here are just beginning to accept me as a medical professional," Louise said, voicing her concerns. "If they think I'm romantically involved with you, some of them might dismiss my competence again, assume I'm here for personal rather than professional reasons." "Then we'll be careful," William replied. "We'll let our work speak for itself, and we'll let our relationship develop at its own pace. But Louise, I don't want to spend whatever years I have left pretending I don't care about you." Louise squeezed his hand, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the desert climate. "I don't want to pretend either," she admitted. Over the following days, their relationship deepened subtly but unmistakably. They worked together with an easy coordination that spoke of growing intimacy, anticipating each other's needs and supporting each other's decisions with seamless efficiency. Their evening conversations became longer and more personal, touching on dreams for the future as well as memories of the past. The transformation in Louise's confidence continued to evolve as well. She made clinical decisions independently, handled routine procedures without seeking confirmation, and interacted with patients as the primary caregiver rather than an assistant. When the mail truck brought medical supplies from Adelaide, Louise inventoried and organized them according to her own system, one that proved more logical and efficient than the previous arrangement. "You created a much better workflow," William observed as he watched her work. "Everything is more accessible now, better organized for emergency situations." "I've had some experience with emergency medical organization," Louise replied with a smile that carried both modesty and justified pride. One afternoon, as they worked together to treat a rancher who had suffered severe burns from a grass fire, William made a suggestion that surprised Louise with its implications. "I think you should consider applying to medical school," he said as they finished bandaging the patient's injuries. "The University of Adelaide has begun accepting women into their medical program, and with your experience and knowledge, you'd be an exceptional candidate." Louise stopped what she was doing and stared at him. "William, I'm 52 years old. Medical school takes years, and then there's internship and residency. I'd be nearly 60 before I could practice independently." "So, you'll be nearly 60 anyway. The question is whether you'll be 60 with a medical degree or 60 wishing you had pursued one." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Louise had dreamed of becoming a doctor when she was young, but the barriers for women had seemed insurmountable in a generation. Now, with changing social attitudes and a proven competence, the possibility seemed less impossible than it once had. "Even if I were accepted," she said slowly, "what about Millbrook Station? The people here need medical care, and you can't manage everything alone." "We'll find a way," William replied with certainty. "Perhaps I could handle routine care while you're away studying, and you could return during breaks to help with emergencies. Or maybe we could bring in another nurse to assist while you're completing your training." Louise felt tears prick her eyes as she contemplated this unexpected possibility. You would really support something like that, even though it would mean significant changes for both of us. Louise, William said, taking her hands in his, I want to see you achieve everything you're capable of accomplishing. If that means supporting you through medical school, helping you establish your own practice, or simply continuing to work together as equals in this remote corner of the world, I'm prepared to do whatever it takes. In that moment, Louise understood that what was growing between them was more than romance or companionship. It was a true partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the deep satisfaction of working together toward common goals. William wasn't just offering his heart. He was offering his faith in her abilities and his commitment to her professional growth. As the sun set over the outback that evening, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Louise and William sat together on the clinic's small porch, discussing possibilities neither of them had imagined just weeks earlier. The woman who had arrived in Millbrook Station as a refugee from grief had discovered not just her own strength, but also the profound joy of being loved by someone who saw that strength clearly and wanted to help it flourish. The challenges ahead remained significant. Social expectations, professional obstacles, and the practical difficulties of building a life together in such an isolated place. But for the first time since her husband's death, Louise felt genuinely hopeful about the future. She had rediscovered her competence, earned her community's respect, and found love with a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. The desert night settled around them with its familiar sounds and scents, and Louise reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrifying morning when Dr. McKinnon had collapsed with fever. She had been forced to step into a role she wasn't sure she could fill, and in doing so, she had discovered that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. But perhaps more importantly, she had learned that strength and love were not mutually exclusive. The same qualities that made her an exceptional healer, compassion, determination, and the ability to remain calm under pressure, also made her worthy of deep affection and respect from a man who understood her value. As they prepared to close the clinic for the night, William turned to Louise with an expression that mixed tenderness with something approaching awe. Do you realize what you've accomplished here? He asked quietly. You've not only saved lives and earned community's trust, but you've also shown everyone what's possible when we stop limiting people based on assumptions about what they can or cannot do. Louise smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones like warmth from a well-tended fire. I think I'm just beginning to realize it myself, she replied. The woman who had spent 3 years being underestimated had finally stepped fully into her power. And in doing so, she had found both professional fulfillment and personal happiness in the place she least expected to discover either. Chapter 4. More Than Enough. The emergency came at dawn on a Tuesday morning in late March, when the autumn air still carried the lingering heat of summer but promised the cooler temperatures that would make life in the outback more bearable. Louise was reviewing inventory in the clinic's dispensary when she heard the sound of multiple vehicles arriving at high speed, their engines straining and their tires throwing up clouds of red dust. Through the window, she saw a sight that made her heart skip. 3 trucks loaded with injured people, and Tom Bradley jumping down from the lead vehicle with blood on his shirt and panic in his eyes. Miss Hartwell, he shouted, reverting to a formal name in his distress. We need help. There's been a massive accident at the railway crossing. The morning mail train hit a truck carrying workers to the new mine site. Louise felt the familiar surge of clinical focus that came with serious emergencies, but this time it was accompanied by complete confidence in her ability to handle whatever awaited her. She was no longer the uncertain woman who had hesitated before treating her first emergency. She was a seasoned medical professional who had proven herself capable of managing complex crises. How many injured? She asked, already gathering supplies and organizing her mental triage priorities. At least 8, maybe more. Some of them are pretty bad, miss. There's one fellow who... Tom's voice broke off as he struggled to find words for what he had witnessed. Dr. McKinnon appeared from the back room, having heard the commotion. Though still somewhat weak from his recent illness, his eyes were clear and alert. William, I need you to handle the walking wounded and the minor injuries, Louise said with calm authority. I'll take the most serious cases. Tom, help me set up additional treatment areas in the main room and the supply closet. We'll need every available space. There was no hesitation in Louise's voice, no request of permission or confirmation. She had assumed command of the situation with the natural authority that came from proven competence, and both men responded immediately to her instructions. The injured began arriving in waves, carried on makeshift stretchers and supported by uninjured companions. Louise moved among them with swift efficiency, conducting rapid triage assessments and organizing patients according to the severity of their conditions. Years of emergency experience had taught her to make these critical decisions quickly and accurately, separating those who needed immediate intervention from those who could wait. The most seriously injured was a young man named David Morrison, Mrs. Morrison's nephew, who had been visiting from Adelaide, whose leg was severely crushed and who showed signs of internal bleeding. Louise recognized immediately that his condition was life-threatening and would require all her surgical skills to address. "Get him onto the main examination table," she instructed the men carrying his stretcher. "I need good light and easy access from all sides." A middle-aged woman named Ellen Rodriguez had suffered a severe head injury and was unconscious but breathing steadily. An elderly Aboriginal worker named Albert Hayes had multiple broken ribs and possible lung damage. A teenager whose name Louise didn't know had a dislocated shoulder and deep lacerations on his arms and chest. As Louise worked to stabilize each patient, she was aware of the community gathering outside the clinic. Word had spread quickly about the accident, and people were arriving to offer help, seek news of injured relatives, and witness how their medical team would handle the crisis. Mrs. Patterson. Louise called to Sarah, who had arrived with several other women. "I need you to organize the volunteers. We'll need clean water, extra blankets, and someone to coordinate messages to families. Mrs. Henderson, your steady hands will be helpful in the minor treatment area. Can you assist Dr. McKinnon with cleaning wounds and preparing bandages?" Louise was orchestrating the emergency response with the skill of a seasoned commander, delegating responsibilities and utilizing every available resource. The community members who had once doubted her capabilities now followed her instructions without question, recognizing her expertise and trusting her judgment completely. The most challenging case was young David Morrison, whose crushed leg required immediate surgery to prevent both infection and permanent disability. As Louise examined his injuries, she realized that the procedure would be more complex than anything she had attempted previously, requiring precise reconstruction of damaged bones and blood vessels. "William," she called to Dr. McKinnon, who was suturing a deep cut on another patient's forehead. "I need you to assist with a complex surgical procedure. David's leg requires extensive reconstruction." Dr. McKinnon looked up from his patient, taking in the severity of David's condition with a quick glance. "Louise, that's beyond what we can safely attempt here. Perhaps we should stabilize him and arrange transport to Adelaide." "He won't survive the journey," Louise replied with quiet certainty. "The internal bleeding is too severe, and his blood pressure is already dropping. If we don't operate immediately, we'll lose him." Louise was no longer asking for permission or seeking approval. She was making a medical decision based on her assessment of the situation, and she expected her colleague to support her judgment. The transformation in their professional relationship was complete. They were now truly equals, with Louise often taking the lead in critical situations. "Then let's get started," William said simply, moving to prepare for surgery with complete faith in Louise's abilities. The operation lasted 4 hours, with Louise performing the most delicate work while Dr. McKinnon assisted and managed anesthesia. The community waited outside in tense silence, understanding that one of their young men's life hung in the balance and that his survival depended entirely on the skill and determination of the woman many of them had once dismissed. Louise worked with a steady precision that had made her legendary among the military surgeons she had assisted during the war. Her hands never trembled, her focus never wavered, and her clinical judgment remained clear throughout the complex procedure. She reconstructed shattered bones, repaired torn blood vessels, and cleaned debris from deep wounds with the expertise of someone who had performed similar operations dozens of times. When she finally emerged from the surgery, her surgical gown stained with blood and her face exhausted but triumphant, Louise found the entire community waiting for news. Mrs. Morrison sat in the front row of chairs that had been arranged in the waiting area, her face pale with worry and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "David is going to be fine," Louise announced, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become her trademark. The surgery was successful, and he should make complete recovery. He'll need several months of rehabilitation, but there's no reason he won't regain full use of his leg. The relief that swept through the gathered crowd was palpable. Mrs. Morrison burst into tears, and several other community members wiped their eyes as they processed the news. But more than relief, Louise could see something else in their faces, profound respect and gratitude for the woman who had once again proven herself capable of performing miracles. Tom Bradley stepped forward, his weathered face reflecting emotions he struggled to articulate. "Miss Hartwell, Louise, I don't know how to thank you properly. What you've done today, what you've been doing for all of us, it's beyond anything we had a right to expect. You had every right to expect competent medical care," Louise replied gently. "That's what I'm here to provide." But even as she spoke, Louise understood that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with the community. She was no longer fighting for acceptance or struggling to prove her worth. She had become, simply and completely, their trusted healer, the person they turned to in crisis, the professional they relied upon for both routine care and emergency intervention. Over the following days, as Louise monitored the recovery of the accident victims and managed the ongoing needs of her regular patients, she began to receive visitors who came not for medical care but to express their gratitude and respect. Charlie Munro brought his entire family to thank her for saving David Morrison. The railway workers who had witnessed the accident stopped by to shake her hand and tell anyone who would listen about her incredible skill and composure. Most significantly, the town council approached Louise with an unprecedented request. "We'd like to offer you a permanent position as Millbrook Station's chief medical officer," announced Robert Patterson, the council chairman. "Dr. McKinnon would remain as consulting physician, but we want you to be our primary healthcare provider." Louise was stunned by the offer, which represented not just professional recognition, but a complete reversal of the social hierarchy that had once kept her in a subordinate role. "The salary would be commensurate with your responsibilities and achievements," Patterson continued. "We've also voted to fund your application to medical school, should you choose to pursue that path. The University of Adelaide has confirmed that they would accept your clinical experience in lieu of some traditional prerequisites." Louise looked at Dr. McKinnon, who was smiling with genuine pride and satisfaction. "This is what I meant about finding a way to support your goals," he said quietly. "The community recognizes your abilities, and they want to invest in your future." As Louise considered the remarkable turn her life had taken, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3.5 years earlier, she had arrived in Millbrook Station as a refugee from grief, seeking nothing more than distance from painful memories. She had been prepared to spend her remaining years in quiet service, supporting another person's work while hiding her own capabilities behind a facade of feminine deference. Instead, circumstances had forced her to reveal her true self, and in doing so, she had discovered that her true self was far more capable and valuable than she had ever imagined. The community that had once seen her as merely an assistant now recognized her as their most skilled medical professional. The colleagues who had once questioned her judgment now sought her opinion on complex cases. The patients who had once looked past her now requested her care specifically. But perhaps most importantly, Louise had learned that professional recognition and personal happiness were not mutually exclusive. Her relationship with William had deepened into genuine partnership, built on shared respect and common purpose. He had become not just a romantic partner but her greatest advocate, supporting her ambitions and celebrating her achievements with unqualified enthusiasm. That evening, as they sat together reviewing the recovery progress of the accident victims, William raised a subject that both of them had been contemplating since the council's offer. "What are you thinking about medical school?" he asked. "The funding removes a financial obstacle, and your clinical experience would give you a significant advantage over traditional students." "I'm thinking that 52 might not be too old to start over after all," Louise replied with a smile that reflected both excitement and determination. "Though I'd want to continue working here during breaks and holidays. Millbrook Station has become home." "We could make that work easily," William assured her. "And Louise, I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll support completely. If you want to establish your own practice after graduation, if you want to specialize in surgery, If you want to travel and work in different places, I'll find a way to make it possible." Louise felt tears of gratitude and happiness well up in her eyes. "What about us? What about our relationship?" "Our relationship will adapt to support your goals," William replied with complete certainty. "I love you not despite your ambitions, but because of them. I want to spend my life with a woman who's achieving everything she's capable of accomplishing." On Sunday afternoon, the community of Millbrook Station gathered for an unprecedented celebration. They had organized a formal recognition ceremony to honor Louise's contributions and to celebrate her new position as Chief Medical Officer. The entire population of the settlement attended, along with workers from surrounding stations and even some Aboriginal families who had benefited from Louise's respectful and competent care. Tom Bradley, serving as Master of Ceremonies, stood before the gathered crowd and spoke with the eloquence of someone who had learned to see beyond his initial assumptions. 3.5 years ago, we welcomed Nurse Louise to our community. He began. "I'll be honest, many of us didn't fully appreciate what we were receiving. We saw an assistant when we should have recognized a leader. We saw someone who made good tea when we should have seen someone who could save lives." The crowd murmured agreement, many people nodding as they recalled their own initial dismissal of Louise's capabilities. But Louise never held our blindness against us. Tom continued. "She simply continued to serve our community with skill, compassion, and dedication until we finally learned to see clearly. She became the healer we needed, the leader we didn't know we were looking for, and the friend we were lucky enough to discover." Louise sat in the front row, wearing her best dress and feeling overwhelmed by the affection and respect being expressed by people who had once treated her as invisible. Beside her, William squeezed her hand gently, his own eyes bright with pride and love. Mrs. Morrison stepped forward to present Louise with a handcrafted medical bag, beautifully tooled leather bearing her initials and the words Chief Medical Officer, Millbrook Station. "This is from all of us," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "to thank you for everything you've done and to support you in everything you're going to accomplish." As Louise accepted the gift, she thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment of recognition and celebration. She had learned that strength could be quiet, that leadership didn't require loudness, and that competence spoke more eloquently than any argument or defense. But she had also learned something more personal and profound, that it was possible to rebuild a life after loss, to discover new purposes and capabilities in the second half of existence, and to find love that honored rather than diminished her professional ambitions. When the formal ceremony concluded and the community began to disperse for evening meals and family time, Louise and William walked together toward the clinic that had become the center of both their professional and personal lives. "Any regrets about coming to the Outback?" William asked as they paused to watch the sun set over the endless red landscape. Louise considered the question seriously, thinking about all the paths her life might have taken if she had remained in Adelaide, all the safe but unfulfilling choices she might have made. "None whatsoever," she replied finally. "I came here broken and uncertain, thinking I was too old and too damaged to start over. Instead, I discovered that I was exactly old enough and experienced enough to recognize an opportunity when it presented itself." As they entered the clinic together, Louise reflected on the remarkable transformation of her circumstances. She was no longer just a nurse who brewed tea while others did the important work. She had become the central figure in her community's healthcare system, a respected professional whose opinions carried weight, and whose skills were acknowledged without question. More than that, she had become a woman who understood her own worth, who could accept love without feeling she had to diminish herself to deserve it, and who faced the future with confidence rather than fear. The desert evening settled around Millbrook Station with its familiar sounds and scents, and Louise prepared for another night of caring for her patients and planning for a future that stretched ahead with unprecedented possibility. She had proven to herself and her community that some people are capable of far more than the world initially expects of them. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be, especially when you find yourself surrounded by people who see your strength clearly and want to help it flourish. underscore 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 underscore. Louise was never just a nurse. She became the quiet force that carried a whole town through its darkest hour and found love where no one thought it would bloom. If a story moved you, please subscribe and leave a comment below. What part of a journey resonated most with you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Because out here in the Outback, the stories we share remind us we are never truly alone.